Phil Clark is a professor of international studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, part of the University of London. Phil Clark, thanks so much for your time. How many of Museveni's election victories would you classify as legitimate?
I think it would be difficult to characterize any of his electoral victories as legitimate. We've seen systematic rigging of these votes at almost every single election. This last election, where Museveni was pitted against Bobi Wine, was very similar to the 2006 election, where Museveni went up against Kizza Besigye as the main opposition leader. And these have been the two most violent elections. They were also the closest at the ballot box, but they were also the most violent and the most systematically rigged. Those are the two elections where I think the opposition had got its act together and felt that it could genuinely challenge Museveni. But in response to that challenge, we saw the government crack down violently against opposition supporters and use almost every possible rigging tactic in the book. And that's the kind of thing that causes a huge amount of disappointment and a huge amount of anger right across Uganda today.
With such a young population, I mean, demographically, it's so interesting, Uganda. How does Museveni keep himself relevant? What are the changes that he has to make? I mean, will he actually make those changes? I mean, has he got his own ideas, or are people imposing them upon him and saying, you have to do this?
I think Museveni's beyond the point of being able to reform himself or reinvent himself. But there's no doubt that as a party, the National Resistance Movement, the ruling party, was really rocked by what happened during this election campaign. And I think in particular, they were rocked by the number of young people who mobilized behind Bobi Wine. I think even this party that's been in power for so long is realizing that there's a generational shift on, and that someone like Bobi Wine is tapping into a deep sense of anger, a deep sense of discontent amongst younger Ugandans. And that sense of discontent is only going to grow if the ruling party doesn't respond to that challenge. So that is the big issue for Museveni now that he's won this sixth term and he's going to end up being in power for more than 40 years, is what is he going to do? What can he say to those young Ugandans who right across the country are really furious, in fact, about this inauguration today?
It's so easy to be cliched about Africa. When you look at the history of the continent just over the past 40 years, and you see how many of its countries have become true democracies, it's really impressive, right? But then you look at the list of the world's longest serving leaders, and so many in the top are Africans. So a man like Museveni, who's been in charge for 36 years, is he still an honest leader? I mean, because when you look at the history of African leaders who have been there for decades, usually there's that whole system of patronage, how they've managed to mold society to serve them and their closest allies. Has Museveni been any different?
No, I think the picture that you just painted is precisely the picture of Museveni. This was a leader and a party that came to power in 1986 with real hopes, a real revolutionary vision of the kind of Uganda that they wanted to build. And of course, his party, the NRM, came to power having toppled a long period of dictatorship in Uganda. But what we've seen over time is a party that has fallen into the trap of monstrous corruption, the profound underdevelopment of the country, particularly in opposition areas, and a real leaving behind of the younger generation in all of that. I think one of the other things that has to be remembered about Ugandan politics, and this feeds into that youth disenchantment, is that younger Ugandans don't remember the 1980s when Museveni first came to power. They don't see him as the great liberation leader. They only see him now as the president who's overstayed his welcome and has overseen this incredibly corrupt and underdeveloping government. So that's the generation now that is voicing a very different vision for Uganda. And the question now for the NRM is how will they respond to that demand coming particularly from younger Ugandans?
Phil, really, really interesting to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much. Phil Clark from SOAS in London.